Just for those of us, most of the speakers have been pretty familiar to everybody. I would just like to point out Eric Isaacs is, a former provost at University of Chicago. More importantly, I think for our point of view, a former director of Argonne National Laboratory, and he has now joined the Research Corporation for. Oh, I'll let you do the science advancement, and will
Right.
be talking to us about private funding, but he knows a lot about public funding.
Yeah. Let me just share. Do you have to give me
I think you
okay.
can share.
Yeah, I can do it. Here we go. How's that?
Great. I
Okay.
need to go to full screen. Yeah, great.
All right. All right. Well, really delighted to be here. I really appreciate the invitation from Heidi and Sally. I'm going to talk about private funding foundations primarily because I know so much about it. I've been here for a whole 4 weeks. Um, but it really is it's an interesting perspective, especially now. I mean, things are changing rapidly, which sometimes feels devastating, I'm sure, to everybody in this meeting, but also there's some interesting opportunities here. So what I'm going to try to do is what I'll try to do is talk a little about motivations and foundations, advantages and challenges, how we can, how we have and how we will make a difference in the science ecosystem. I'm going to take the prerogative of just mentioning Research Corp for a few minutes. I'll just talk about, just briefly about us, but also about a couple of examples in our history, some recent, some much earlier history, that exemplify how foundations can work and how they make investments that can grow, and how they can go in early so that later, for example, government can step in. And this is, of course, particularly important in particle physics. I'll talk a little about decision making. I think Heidi and Sally asked if I could do that. That's also made up, but it's pretty common, and there are others from foundations here. They can surely comment. There is an organization that's emerged in the last decade. It's really fantastic, and I'll talk briefly about the Philanthropy Alliance, largely because a lot of people in there, a lot of the foundations in there might be helpful for HEP. And then I'll just finish with a couple of thoughts on how to get funding. So I don't have to say this, you probably talked about it last couple of days, but there are new realities for science here and science philanthropy, largely turmoil right now. And I don't just mean cuts to budgets like at DOE and NSF. I also mean that science philanthropy is a growth potential. There's a lot of money that's, in the pockets of individuals and foundations that's just burning in those pockets and waiting to be spent, but it's not yet committed. So thinking about the future, one should think about how to speak to philanthropists, how to speak to foundations to unlock some of this resource. And I'll talk a little bit about that too. But I thought I would start by just giving the big picture about what funding in this country looks like. We're pretty unique in the world in terms of foundation and private philanthropy, in the sense that this is 22. It's hard to get more recent results, but this was from an article this spring by Bob Kahn et al. But you can see the federal funding. This is for basic and applied, and we can sit here and talk about what use-inspired versus foundational or fundamental science looks like. Let's not do that now. But you can see the total philanthropy, which consists of two chunks. One is a chunk that's current year philanthropy from foundations, from private investors, and legacy, which often refers to what universities have in their pockets. This is usually restricted funds at a university, but it has been donated over the years in centers and in chaired positions, et cetera. Self-funded is really like hospitals will self-fund research because they have enough of a margin with some of the resources they build up from patients. So this gives you a sense that right now, within the last several years, philanthropy is pushing on 40% of what the federal government does. So it's already pretty significant. If you go back to the 60s, it was only about 20% or less. So it's a big change, and it's something to be watching. So first, motivations for science foundations. First and foremost, it's to enable high-risk, long-horizon discovery science. I think most philanthropists or most foundation heads and directors or research directors you'll talk to will say they want to invest in early stage research that may not be fit. In other words, what can we do that's not getting done elsewhere? And as I said, I'll give you some examples of that in a few minutes. There's of course a real drive to think about and join with universities and federal funding to shape future directions in science education. There's a real concern everywhere. I heard a little bit of this even this morning. Not only innovative pedagogy, because the world is changing, students are changing, and what they expect is changing. So learning and teaching are changing very rapidly. And so foundations are very interested in this because they really also are interested in expanding the pipeline. And this includes inclusion and all that, but it really is expanding the pipeline because of the fear that we're going to run out. Immigration aside, we're going to run out of great scientists for the future. So we focus a lot on those kinds of things. There's a lot of support for R&D with commercial potential. You've probably seen this. I just mentioned quantum information. That's, of course, basic science right now, important for particle physics, but also important for commercial potential. Foundations often look to fill gaps left by constrained public funds. Part of the reason for that might be very early funding, too high risk. Part of it might be it's just not in their mission statement. And so foundations can be flexible that way. And finally, what foundations can do, and federal governments and universities can do the same, is invest in an individual, a personal passion. Someone comes to a foundation with a brilliant idea that's potentially earth-shaking or galaxy-shaking. It can be something foundations pivot to. I thought I'd mention a couple of modalities. Again, many of you are familiar with this, those of you that work with foundations, but just to set the baseline. So modalities, direct grants to researchers or groups of researchers. We do that at the Research Corporation quite a bit, but many foundations do that. Endowed programs like chairs, centers like the Kavli Institutes around the country for theoretical physics, for particle astrophysics. Programmatic multi-year initiatives, which are also centers or grand challenges like Breakthrough and all those. There is a history of investment in infrastructure and capital, believe it or not, even though in HEP it's expensive. And I'll give you an example in instrumentation, but also upgrades to instrumentation. There is an interest in that. There are prize-based funding like Breakthrough and Kravli prizes, which recognize great science, but also invest directly in the science being carried out today. One of the big modes of operation, like with the Vera Rubin Observatory, is public-private partnerships to co-fund large projects, and I'll talk about that briefly too. And then finally, grants for teacher scholars. We do that heavily because we're very interested in the teaching aspects and evolving teaching methodology to make sure that faculty at universities who are researchers, scholars, are also developing innovative teaching programs, and then of course seed grants, small amounts of money to get something going. So a couple of advantages and then challenges, and these are not uniformly perfectly true all the time. These are on average how we think of advantages. The first is speed and flexibility in funding, being able to turn on a dime if something really exciting comes up. Support for high risk. We can debate high risk, high reward, theory or experiment, but you just saw there's over 100 million, the largest gift to theory in physics, I think ever. And I'll come back to that, but 100 million to various centers around the country for very interesting centers on theory. And then I will say, I said it already at the beginning, there is a growth of private interest in fundamental science, and there is a lot of money sitting in the bank that we would all like to see let go and out into science. And so you should all be thinking about that, I think. So the challenges for this group is, of course, HEP experiments are often, probably always, too large for private backing. Initial funding, maybe not, but sustainable funding. Certainly, the foundations may invest early in a muon collider. Foundations are not going to build a muon collider. I hope NSF, DOE figure out a way to do that. The risk of redundancy is there because foundations have their own missions. They've got their own donors and founders. They seek to make an impact on their own. So there is a risk that you get fragmentation. Particle physicists, you might say, well, let's get all the foundations to fund one big thing, like initiate a muon collider. You could try that, but it's difficult because each of us have a different mode of operation and modalities, but also different missions that are sometimes tied back to our founders, sometimes not. And then the challenge is always alignment with scientific interests of a donor. And any of you who have been out trying to raise funds know this very well. So let me just talk briefly about this Research Corp. Again, I'm taking a little bit of speaker's privilege here, but I think it's important to hear how one foundation started. And Frederick Cottrell actually started, he's a chemist at Berkeley for much of his career. He took other jobs, but he invented something called the electrostatic precipitator in the early 1900s, but of course important today in many ways too. It's basically a stick on a smokestack and pull out using electrostatic techniques to precipitate out fumes, dust, etc. And he made some money. So what he did, he was a teacher of chemistry, a very well-regarded teacher. And what he did is he took all the funds that he got from this invention, and he put it into something called the Research Corporation, realizing that early career scientists have a really tough time getting started. And they also have the biggest chance of maybe making a big hit. Bet on the youngsters, he said. So he gave all of his earnings. Now, Cottrell was not, he was in the same period of the big, like Carnegie or Rockefeller. He was not that kind of wealth, but he took all of the profits and proceeds and he gave them to RCSA. So he had the giving pledge, but he also did something a little different. The early work that we funded over the years, 43 Nobel Prizes, most recently in 21 and 22 in chemistry, others in physics, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then finally, we in particular, this is our mission, focus on physical sciences with adjacent fields. There's some biology, but we have funded particle physicists, we have funded astrophysicists, and we continue to really invest in innovative teaching, as I mentioned before. So I wanted to give you two examples because not just because they're us, although I like to, in my new job, like to brag about what I'm doing, but importantly, these are sort of the way things have happened with foundations. And in many ways, we still hope for them. These are great examples. I think Heidi and Sally asked me to mention this one. And this came out of a personal relationship between Cottrell and Lawrence. They were both faculty at Berkeley. Lawrence was in the early days of trying to figure out how to accelerate things, particular protons. And this note was written, I'm sure it was an email at the time, but it was written from Lawrence to Cottrell, and I give the date here. I'm hastening to let you know that the experiments on the production of high-speed protons has been successful beyond expectations. And that actually immediately, Cottrell, this is already almost 20 years into the Research Corporation. So Cottrell turns around in 1931, which was very early on, within weeks of that July 17th note, and he makes his first grant to Lawrence, and he continues to fund Lawrence through the 30s. I would argue this was beginning of the era of big science. All of you are part of that. I've been part of it as a synchrotron jockey. This was essentially described in the book hopefully many of you read by Michael Hiltzik. But it was really an important investment, but we kept investing in Lawrence as an individual to drive the cyclotron. And at the same time, and within a few years, Lawrence assigns the management of his IP to Research Corp. In those days, the universities had not become, very attached to IP. They didn't yet realize the full value of IP. And then in 1939, he wins the Nobel Prize. So this is a great story of a very tight circle of a risk taken by Cottrell, maybe not a big risk. Lawrence was brilliant, obviously, and it was clear he was, and he was doing great stuff. But this is an example of a leader of a foundation who says, this is a smart guy. Let's give the money. Let's do something quick with it. And it worked. The second example is a little different, but similar. And I wanted to give a little bit of the history of the NSF-DOE Rubin Observatory because it's mostly overlooked. The history I'm showing here is the one everybody here knows. Sloan Sky Survey was just getting first light in 2001. We had a couple of great scientists. There were others too. I'm just mentioning Tony Tyson, who I knew at Bell Labs, and Roger Andrew, who's here in Tucson at the University of Arizona. Tyson was already planning and thinking about what a larger aperture and wider angle telescope could do. And of course, Roger was in the midst of developing how do you make these big instruments, right? How do you make the big mirrors? By 2005, which is pretty quick, the NSF awarded LSST. I could be wrong on some of the details, by the way, so correct me. An important private contribution was Simonian Gates, and then more on the detector, but Simonian Gates gave money at the beginning, largely for mirrors, but other instrumentation. And then finally, NSF and DOE authorized full funding. And now, of course, very excited, we've gotten first light. But I'm going to open up the earlier history of what actually happened, which is a foundation story. And this is how we love to see stories like this. Actually, the first grant from the Research Corporation to Roger Angel was in 1969. And he went on to develop the spin casting technique for mirrors and polishing. which is where the 8.4 meter mirrors come from for the Giant Magellan Telescope and also Rubin. And in the early 2000s, the Research Corporation the president happened to be the ex-president from University of Arizona, and he went on to form the first LSST Corporation, which is now called the Alliance. And in fact, early on, they donated the glass. RCSA and University of Arizona donated extra glass from the Large Binocular Telescope, which is 8.4 meter mirrors, to the Rubin Telescope. So this is a great example of how smaller investments, millions of dollars, not non-trivial, but end up in these big impacts. So what I thought I would do at request is just, this is my view of how governance works in foundations, how these decisions are made. The ones I showed you have a lot to do with the internal discussions at foundations and realizing the importance. And it's often led by the president, but not always. And so this is sort of how a project might develop in a foundation. So very often, not always, this is not dispositive by any means. It's just an example, an average way that it's done. The president of the organization or leader of the organization works internally, but also consults external advisors. This could be the particle physics community. We have advisory committees. Most of these foundations have advisory committees, and they're important in overseeing and suggesting ideas, as are boards. And then there are internal program directors, and I'll come back to this. Get to know the program directors if you want to get the money, because they're the folks who actually can funnel in ideas through into the system. So after that discussion, often you then start defining the program with funds and timing. You work with your administrative, because strategy is money, or funds, and funds is strategy. So you can't work without that leadership. Very important. And then importantly, the board weighs in. And this is where there are challenges here sometimes, and there's also advantages. The challenge might be a founder's still alive, very influential in the foundation, and is strongly directing what kind of science gets done. Not good or bad. It could be great, right? You look at the Gates Foundation, or you look at, Heising-Simons, they do some great work in astrophysics, et cetera, but they can have a lot of influence. And then finally, and importantly now, and I'll talk about the Science Philanthropy Alliance, a lot of foundations are starting to think collaboratively, much more than they did in the past, largely because a lot of these things are expensive, but also there's common interests and unique capabilities each of us have that can be shared amongst our partners. So this is kind of a quick overview of how things get decided. And I hope it's useful, but I will post this talk. In terms of physics, this is just a few ideas that are now in the works at some foundations. We're certainly thinking about all these things, but thinking about what kind of funding, you can match. There's probably the obvious science-directed stuff like quantum information in an HEP, like theory. We just saw the Lineweber Foundation give all this money to theory and applied math. Astronomy, astrophysics, and cosmology attracts the attention of a lot of different foundations and individuals, as you know. It's a good thing to press on, and an exciting thing, which a lot of private investors want. Planetary and space sciences, I won't talk much about it, but there's also a real interest in inclusivity, collaborative models, thinking about what your teams look like. And then when I say decentralized science and open source infrastructure, things like the Rubin, which is open data, which was probably innovated by Sloan Digital Sky Survey, at least for astrophysics. These kinds of things have great interest, especially to people who are in the IT business. We have a bunch of very wealthy people from technology who are interested in this kind of thing. And you're at the forefront of this in particle physics. So it's an interesting thing to be thinking about in terms of private funding. I can't go without saying, of course, right now, we do have a real issue with bridge funding. All the foundations that I'm aware of are now looking to fund mostly our own stakeholders, our own supported scientists, but looking for ways to put money out in the short term just to bridge, to make sure people stay in the field. And this is going to be true in particle physics too. And I know in some ways particle physics has not struggled, but had this issue for decades because of the fact that the highest energy accelerator is no longer in the US. And so thinking about how you train early career staff, scientists, et cetera, is really important. So this is really aligned with what probably particle physicists have been thinking for a long time. So I'm just going to mention, actually, I'm not going to go over this in detail. I'm just going to show you the Science Philanthropy Alliance. It was formed because more than 70% of philanthropy typically goes to biomedical, medicine, which is reasonable. A lot of people want to invest in health. So about a little over a decade ago, the Science Philanthropy Alliance was formed. It was formed with 6 different foundations. I boxed them in orange here, with the idea that it would be a way to influence donors to think about physical sciences, to think about the adjacent fields in physical sciences, so that there would be a place they could go for advice, there would be a place they could go for, partnerships, and then hopefully and ultimately advance scientific discovery through philanthropy by funneling a little bit more money to the physical sciences, right? Which might have been only 20% or less back in the day. It's still a smaller percentage, but this was formed with 5 or 6 foundations, and now it's a big group. You probably recognize and you've dealt with some of these foundations. And it's fantastic because it's also evolved into a professional society for foundations. So if you're thinking about foundation money, talk to France Cordova, for example, because she, France probably. She obviously was head of NSF. She's an astrophysicist, but this kind of thing is turning out to be a great advantage, and it's now in particular with all the turmoil becoming a place to lean. So I just thought I would give Isaac's advice. I mean, everybody here probably has thought about it. Private funding for HEP, you know, of course, and this is obvious because you do the same with federal target outreach and proposals to philanthropists or foundations who have aligned interests. And I think from the list I just showed you, you could go to the SPA, the SPA as we call it, and go through all of them and decide. But you really have to get to know the program directors. You can come and talk to me as president, but getting to know program directors is often where ideas filter into a thing. And the most important thing, and I've said this for decades, but and probably obvious, but a lot of people forget is, you're going to someone who has a lot of money and they want to know, why should I care? And it's so important to get on top of that. Like you can go and say, particles, we're understanding the origins of the universe, and that's all great, but you have to find something that they care about. And that's why I think that is probably the most important thing you can imagine doing. Aligning your goals with broader impact, like technology, like AI, like quantum, like all kinds of technology. A lot of the money is sitting in the hands of these tech giants. And I think having that relationship, which you certainly do, you were the earliest in big data and thinking about how to transport big data, analyze big data. Ruben's now going through the same thing, and they're learning and learning, but you have been doing this for a long time. Quantum computing is and quantum sensors are at the heart of what a lot of you are doing. So I think that's a great thing for you to be thinking about. I do think it's important to communicate and with your peers, but also public interest, because a lot of these philanthropies are interested in that, having, it's a brand issue, but it's also interested in supporting science that has real importance, but also will have a broad interest. And then, of course, the fourth is the obvious: leverage partnerships. National labs are building big things, universities and private institutes. That's just sort of. So let me finish here. Just to say, foundations have long catalyzed bold physics, real physics, fundamental physics. Will continue to do so. The shifts in U.S. funding are becoming a reality. It's a very positive statement from my point of view. Philanthropy will have to find new and creative ways. We are looking. Everybody is in a state of transition and really thinking about big motivation, big transitions. But really, the core beliefs, the core guidelines, risk, innovation, agility, are going to stay with foundations. And I would just ask you to stay tuned, because this is all evolving on a weekly basis. And finally, I think foundations do their best when they shape science not by size. We're not building a muon collider, but by strategic vision and investing in people, investing in ideas. And that's my foundation history and story.
Okay, thank you very much for this talk. You definitely delivered on our request.
I
We
tried.
have, we have. I hope you find this useful in talking to other groups as well.
Oh,
By the way, we got him 4 hours into his new job, so that's why he said yes.
well,
Okay,
it was
so
fun.
First
Go ahead.
question is from Larry Lee, brand new RCSA Control Scholar from the University of Tennessee. And it's while the foundations are unlikely to fully replace traditional federal HEP funding schemes, they're in a position to make important contributions with seed funding, e.g. the recent awards from RCSA, Simon, Sloan, and Kavli. We're in an R&D phase for future large facilities like the US-sited muon collider that the NAS and EPP and P5 panels agree could and should be a flagship national priority. But even with university funding from private foundations, the necessary technical accelerator expertise is at our national labs. What would it take for foundations to partner with DOE labs to enable an injection of support for high risk, high reward work?
Oh boy. Well, the good news or bad news is I have perspectives from both sides of this one. And I've asked that question even since I've been here in my 4 weeks, but it's a great question and we're talking about it. The first thing I'm going to say is that we are coming out soon, and I can be firm on this with some supplemental funding or bridge funding for the emergency, and the Cottrell Scholars will see that soon. So hang tight for that. We will be looking to help you out. It's not going to be, we don't have millions and millions to put out there, but we will. In particular, at the first tranche is going to be to address our folks, our own scholars. In terms of working with when you talk about muon colliders, it's at the high end. One thing that we should talk about, one of the programs we run are these innovation. They're called dialogues, science dialogues, and we are always looking for future projects. So that's something to think about. We often with our dialogues, which are really convening opportunities and opportunities to partner and think ahead of the seed funds, in other words, to get stuff done that will be potentially picked up in later years by NSF or DOE. And the muon collider is a really interesting one. I frankly don't know enough about it. I read about it in the Academy's report. In terms of, so we will include that in when we think we are focused on physics and physical sciences. So that's something we will take into consideration. Lastly, in terms of individual support, which, as I've said, that's what we do at Research Corp. We look to early career scientists typically. Working with DOE labs from the inside, I would always say, oh, it's easy. Just, let's just do it. We'll make it happen. And I think we were able to do it a bunch at Argonne. It's difficult. And, all the questions of indirects, again, looking with my new hat, it's difficult. But it doesn't mean I'm not going to go look at that because I know the lab directors and I know DOE fairly well, although it's, changed over time. I know the folks certainly in the Office of Science. So certainly it is my intent to look at that. I mean, the scientists at national labs are, equally punch above their weight. And so we'll look at that. I can't sit here and say it's a done deal. In our dialogues, in our conferences, we have included many national labs. We had one on its storage, and of course we had George Crabtree come as one of our distinguished leaders. But we'll keep looking at that. It's a great question. You can help from your side by talking to your leadership and DOE about foundation funding because it's getting bigger and it's something that you should be able to get at some point.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, indirect's always fun. Spencer
Challenge.
Gessner at Slack asks about the Breakthrough Starshot Initiative pledged $100 million for laser-based spaceflight. This is a significant amount of money for an R&D project. How has that initiative been received, appraised within the private foundation science funding community? How do we encourage more R&D initiatives at that scale?
Huh. Well, I'll say that it's very few foundations that can give at that level, first of all. I mean, there are some, but you should look at the foundation's websites because they have a mission and they deliver on projects. 100 million is a huge number for almost any foundation. Individual, like Schmidt and others, maybe you get lucky. That particular, I mean, look, foundations are pretty like universities are excited when another foundation invests in something big. It is very exciting, and but most of us can't give at that level. That's a very large level. Again, what I suggest is go to the websites that space-based laser technology is a very interesting one, and you can see why a foundation or a philanthropist might get interested in it. It sounds big, it sounds bold, it sounds exciting, and I think that's the best lessons learned from that. But it's pretty unusual to get that kind of money out of a foundation. You can try, but it's a very difficult thing. I don't mean to discourage you because you guys, if anybody, you have big ideas in HEP. So it's worth thinking about that kind of program, that kind of breakout, and really interesting. It has all the qualities I mentioned because it's got a big public interest. You know, space science now is a big deal, or space travel is a big deal, and so it's got a lot of the qualities that could attract big money like that.
Yeah. So next question is actually from Tova Holmes, also an RCSA Terrell Scholar from University of Tennessee. And she says, for RCSA, is there interest in hosting a dialogue around an HEP topic? Specifically, it seems like early work on muon collider challenges could gather a
Yeah.
lot of early career researchers with senior experts with experience making previous colliders happen.
Yeah. Um, I personally have a real interest in the muon collider. I think when I saw it, when I read the Academy report, I was a little surprised, but because of the cost right now and the optics. But I would offer out a challenge for that because it's not out of the question. Something like a muon collider would probably take several of us together, several of our foundations. I mean, I can name a few that might be interested. Certainly, places like Simons, Kavli, in their interest in basic physics, and Heising Simons. There are a few out there that could have an interest, including some of the individuals like Schmidt. So my proposal, I mean, my email is open. So if you have an idea, it's great that you're a Cottrell Scholar, by the way. I appreciate a lot of you are here. That's for me, that's a great indication we're funding the right people. But I would just suggest send in your idea. We're now, in fact, in the process because in a couple of years we run out of Scilog, not run out, but we have a whole new tranche of Scilog topics that we're going to be picking. So please, send your ideas. I'd welcome them. I can't promise we would do it because we maybe do 6 a year, but definitely send something and I'd be willing to look at it.
So Jay has a question about would you be willing to put together a website that provides links to private foundation opportunities that could support HEP projects? A site like this would be very, very helpful.
That's really a great question. Let me look into that. I'll talk to Franz Cordova. I'm now on the board for SPA, and that's sort of the, as I said, professional society where a lot of us talk about these kinds of opportunities. So why don't I'll take that as an action item, and I'll go back and talk to the SPA, the Science Philanthropy Alliance, about that. It's a really interesting idea. I want to be careful because I'm new. I also want to be careful because expectations, I want to make sure we manage expectations properly. I will throw out, I mean, a $30 billion machine, maybe you guys probably say, oh no, it's not that much, but whatever size machine it is a big deal. So you have to have really interested people to want to invest early in that. But it's not crazy, and it's a really innovative idea. I mean, I love the strategy in that simple strategy of build something no one else has and stay connected to the proton collider and at CERN, and it's a great strategy. It's just an expensive one, and to get foundations involved, there has to be a really good argument. Nonetheless, broadly about particle physics, it's an interesting. Again, expectation setting. Let me talk to some of my peers. It's a great question.
I'll just comment that as a former department head and dean, associate dean for research, that in fact, yes, most individual PIs and young people are just overwhelmed by the sheer volume of things that they might be able to apply for. And it
Yeah.
would be nice if there were perhaps some central way to find if particular funding initiatives are in fact focused towards particular fields.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah,
Yeah, it's an interesting, I mean, the question, of course, will come up with my peers. Well, why not quantum? Why not, so let me see what I can do. And it's something certainly our CSA could help with. So it's a really good question and it would be a great resource, I think, for a lot of you. So
yeah,
yeah, but in the meantime, I encourage you to go to SPA, Science Philanthropy Alliance, easy to Google, and look at the different, you'll probably recognize many of the foundations and you can go directly to their sites. So you can, it's one step removed, go to their sites, or you can go directly to their sites if you know them, but just to have a reminder of who's in the game. And you can, you can just look at, look at this list and you can probably point to a bunch in here, which would also be doing and thinking about, Lineweber, for example, and I don't know how much more he's going to give away, but certainly Schmidt is always looking for great physics problems. Simons is always looking. Sloan is under a transition because Adam's leaving, but they'll have somebody soon, and so is Moore. But these are the organizations that would be most likely to be doing any of it. Probably not Chan Zuckerberg, but I'd love to get Dalio Philanthropies involved in some of this. But anyway, I'll look into that. It's a great question.
okay. Do we have more
We
questions?
have two more questions. We have one from Liz Sexton Kennedy. Says, combining the last two talks, do you think there are opportunities for private funding on community software tools?
Yes, I do think so. I'll be encouraging on this one. The thing I would say, as with any of these, if you're going to develop tools, the most important thing in my mind is that you have great science outcomes in mind. That here's what this tool is going to do. I think that's the best approach. In other words, instead of saying we got great tools for the community, which by the way, some places fund that, right? I mean, there is, Kavli has done a lot of that. Simons has done quite a bit. I mean, we have people from Simons on this meeting in this meeting, and they may be able to answer that better than I. But there's certainly an interest in tool development. I just spent this week, just by coincidence, the Rubin First Light conference with a few hundred people is here in Tucson. I went to see it, and a lot of the investments now are in exactly community tools. I went to a session developing a lot of community tools. Now, a lot of that is being just done like usual, like skunkworks in various institutions. But I do think it's possible with foundations because they like infrastructure. Foundations like instruments, but you have to have bold science that will be enabled by what you're doing.
There's also a question from Peter Rosen in the chat. It says, I understand your point regarding the $10 billion scale for a new HEP machine, perhaps also for the $1 billion scale as well. Is the $100 million scale for a project now more likely to be supported by private funding than it was in the past?
Well, it's already been, right? I mean, I mentioned Rubin, but it was early funding. So the whole amount, when I joke, because I was at Carnegie for a long time, I used to joke a lot that, that it used to be private philanthropy could build a telescope, right? And actually spoke a lot with Wendy Friedman about this. Now, everything's over $1 billion, so it's real money, and foundations can't do it. But things from the cyclotron to Vera Rubin were all started by foundations, so there's still a lot of room for foundations to get involved. Again, in an exciting project that's really needed by the science community, the potential to really make really important discoveries. The whole 100 million, I think you have to get a partnership amongst foundations. But I would not discourage you from trying that, right? We work together through SPA, we work together independently, and we're never going to come up to 100 million. We might invest in the early researchers, the early career people, but also early research in those areas with good ideas. But the whole 100 million is a more complicated puzzle. And given also, I think that we have agencies in this meeting, it's worth putting together. I think I mentioned this on one of my slides. It's worth putting together that kind of partnership early. But foundations, I think, are willing to take the risk to actually start some of these ideas off. So I would think big, but think science. I mean, you got to have really good science ideas. And Muon Collider is, but that's, you said 10 billion, Sally? Is that what the quoted price is?
Oh, I was just quoting the
Yeah.
remark from Peter Rosen.
Yeah. Well, we can agree to disagree on that one. But I mean, it's not a negative thing, but it's not going to. I believe it will not be 10 billion. But anyway, we can talk about that some other time. But I think it's still worth pushing for. The 100 million is not. So the billion is not crazy, but it's not the full billion. It has to be a partnership.
Ian Fisk has indicated he'd also like to make a comment here.
Sure.
Ian,
Yeah. Bring
Ian, would you like to go ahead?
It was in response to Eric saying that there were people from private foundations who might be able to answer Liz's question. And I guess the answer that, from my perspective, one of the things that we need to, when you go to the foundations to ask for money, if you ask for maintenance of things that other people have done, they will not say yes, because most of the foundations have an expectation, which is that if something should be being funded by the federal government, they're not as interested in it. And in some sense, what they're more interested in is being the seeds for groundbreaking things and making a big impact. And maintenance, almost by definition, is one of the hardest things to convince people that especially maintenance for things that were developed outside. So if for software packages, if someone wanted to do a rewrite of the JAN4, which is going to impact a variety of fields, that's a place that you might be able to get support. But it's not. But for instance, but if you said we have this large, this body of work that we don't have any money to support it, that's probably going to be the less interesting to the foundations.
Yeah, and thank you, Ian. That's perfectly stated. And I would add, this comes back to the statement that foundations like to invest in something early on with the idea that you could say it's a branding opportunity, but more than that, they want to really have an impact. And so just throwing money on a project that it's not a great argument. Throwing money at a project that's struggling because it's lost funding from some other foundation, et cetera. The other thing I would say is that historically, foundations have very much focused on their own mission, and they have to. We have to. I mean, Simons does that right in some ways. It's a very broad mission, but that you focus on your mission, like Kavli does. However, we are now working more and more together. Simons and the Research Corporation work on a bunch of projects together. So there's the opportunity now to think bigger, but they still have to be original ideas. We're willing to collaborate and share originality and share early investment, but they still have to be new ideas, big ideas, ideas that will really impact a broad range of scientists or obviously important science.
Thanks very much.